Hello and welcome into this week's edition of the Old Souls Football Podcast. On this episode, Stephen and I are going to dive into the 2024 Pro Football Hall of Fame class. We go over everybody's resumes and talk about some potential snubs. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Stephen, what did you think of the Super Bowl?
Awesome Super Bowl. I don't know where I'd rank it in terms of where it would finish in terms of how I would rank it in terms of top Super Bowls that I've seen,
Yeah.
but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a really well played game. San Francisco didn't really execute towards the end, and then I think
Mhm.
we really saw the greatness of Patrick Mahomes, and
Yeah.
that was special. I always enjoyed that.
Yeah, it is cool when the world's greatest athletes do rise to the occasion like that. I always do enjoy. I enjoyed it too. I thought it was really hard hitting. I thought it was um there was a lot of caution being played, I think, for a long time,
Yeah.
which is kind of unusual for two teams that have been there before, especially Kansas City.
A lot of Super Bowls are like that though, where it's like a kind of a chess match where these
Yeah,
guys are like
who
going
bites
back and forth.
first?
Yeah. And honestly, I think San Francisco, the mistake they made was I almost felt like they got a little tentative in the first half. I think after
Yeah.
the McCaffrey fumble, like that first drive, they looked like the better team
Oh,
easily.
yes.
And then he fumbles. Chiefs don't do really anything with the ball in the first half,
No,
but
I even remember saying I was at my uncle's house, and I remember saying that first half was starting to remind me of the Kansas City Tampa Bay Super Bowl. Like the amount of pressure that like Mahomes like was really under a lot of duress throughout most of that first half. They were hitting him. Um, they had the run game snuffed out, and the run game had gotten Kansas City to the Super Bowl. It was really the only problem was you didn't have Tom Brady on the other side. Oh, I think who had 3 touchdowns in that Super Bowl in that first half. So the only problem I had with it, I don't know if you and and yes, we're called the Old Souls podcast, but we're not that old. But
yeah.
my God, was that long? I know it played the length of the overtime period that I only found out the rules to the next day.
Hmm.
But I the commercials, like the game used to start at 5:18. Now it doesn't start till 5:45. Halftime
Yeah.
seemed way longer. I remember watching the halftime show, like the studio guys talking. I went and got food, came back out to the kid or out to the front room, and they were just beginning the Usher show. And I was like, "Oh my God. Like we're just starting that now?" I just thought it was way too long.
Yeah.
Um and it's hard, like especially like with the next day being a work day, a school day. Um I think they got to do something like either like whoever can make RFK should have put in that ad he had that mimicked his uncle's ad from 1960. He should have put in there that I'll make the day after the Super Bowl national holiday. He would have gotten a few more votes.
Yeah, that was a bizarre
That
ad. And
was
like,
really bizarre.
yeah, I almost felt like we were like in a utopian world, but
Oh, that's what it felt
yeah.
like. Yeah.
Yeah, we're
But
not like, thankfully we're not a political podcast, but
no.
I think overall it was a really good Super Bowl and we've had I guess the last three have been really good. Because Rams Bengals, that was
Yeah.
a great game.
That was a very
Last year
good
was
game.
awesome. Chiefs
Yeah.
Eagles. And then this year, I mean, we haven't really the only in the last 4 years or 5 years, we've only had one bad Super Bowl, and that was with the
Hmm.
Chiefs and the Bucks, where Tampa Bay just smacked Kansas City in the mouth.
Yeah.
But we've been pretty fortunate because if you go back in history, there's a lot of Super Bowls that have been blowouts, and
Yeah. Yeah. We
and
thankfully missed those days.
yeah, the only thing that kind of that I think like the thing that I noticed about Sundays, like I get it, people are really, I don't want to talk about Taylor Swift or anything, but, like,
Yeah.
people get annoyed by that. I get it, and they find the Chiefs nauseating. I can get that point of view. But the people that told me, like, well, Spag should be the MVP. Number one, Steve Spagnuolo, not a player. Number
Yeah.
two, Patrick Mahomes is the MVP. Did you not watch that drive? That's one of the
Yeah.
greatest drives in Super Bowl history. You're down three in
Mhm.
overtime. You walk down the field against the league's, what I guess, number two defense
Yeah.
and score a touchdown, and you don't blink, you convert a fourth down. Everything he did in that moment is like when you're in the backyard as a kid growing up thinking of playing quarterback, that's the
Yeah. That's
drive.
what you want.
He
He
did it.
beat two top 10 DVOA teams of all time
Yeah.
on the way to the
And,
Super Bowl.
and the I think in my last takeaway before we go into our topic matter is my number one takeaway from that game is the NFL really screwed up in the fact that the Chiefs weren't even that good this year and they won it anyway.
I know. I know.
So I mean, I think they can make it back next year. They got some things to fix. Like, I don't think they're explosive enough, but hell, I guess they are. They
That's
just won the
that's
Super Bowl.
that's the scary thing because
Yeah.
the fact that they can fix it, when you have a Hall of Fame, a bona fide Hall of Fame quarterback, and he's
Yeah.
only 28, you're going to be good for a long time. And speaking of Hall of Fame, another reason why this is such a big week in the NFL, or that was such a big week, is the Hall of Fame induction that happens on the Thursday night. And the Hall of Fame induction, just so you guys understand that are listening, is kind of like like some like podcasts might like live for the draft or the combine, or some drafts or podcasts might live for the Super Bowl, like they want to be on Radio Row or whatever. Yeah, all good things. But me and Steven, like our goal is like we would love to have a live show one day from Canton, Ohio during the Hall of Fame induction because we love the idea of that's what this podcast is about, is showing love to the great of the greats in the NFL
Yeah.
down through the years.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, what's kind of cool about this class is it covers, different eras. There's, a player from the 70s, the 80s. There was a snub or a coach, Buddy Parker, that, he's from the 1950s. Uh, he didn't get in, but we'll talk about him. But that's the cool thing about, I think, this podcast and what we're trying to do is it gives you a better understanding of the nation's number one sport. And when you're talking ball with your friends, you should be able, like, I get so tired of hearing, is this guy the GOAT? Like
Yeah.
Patrick Mahomes, they're already calling I hate those debates, first of all, because I think
Yeah.
every player has their own merit and should be admired for that. And I think you almost diminish the accomplishments of great players because, well, he only won one Super Bowl. Well, that's an incredible accomplishment and it's almost downplayed. But
Yeah.
not to get too off topic, but the point is, like, they're already having that debate because they saw Patrick Mahomes do something on Sunday when Tom Brady retired, what, last year?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
That's true. It's like
yeah,
we forgot about him already.
yeah, it's like and I think the point of this podcast is we are not here to be the get off my lawn type
Yeah.
and say the players today suck and all that. That's not the case. We love
No.
football now just as much
Hmm.
as the stuff that, and we're not here to say football was better in whatever year. But the whole point is, like, how is it different?
Yeah.
Who were the great players? How do they compare today? And having and just going over resumes of great players, you just know more about the game. It's more fun that way.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting that. I probably couldn't have said that better. Let's
And plus,
talk about, or go ahead, Steve. Sorry.
and lastly, I mean, it gives you more stuff to watch in March and
It
April when
does.
there's, yeah, because you could either do that or, I mean, NBA All Star weekends this week if that's more of your thing. But
I didn't even
I'd
know.
yeah, I'd rather just watch, the Orange Crush defense, I guess.
Well, that was like somebody put on Twitter, like, no, the football's over. It's baseball season. I was like, oh, okay. I mean, I'll put on baseball when the time comes, but I'm not
Yeah.
excited for it.
Well, in baseball, like I'll look at it more in August and September when there's a
It's
pennant race.
it's the best background noise, like you're getting something done around the house and in May, you're like, oh yeah, I'll
Yeah.
put this on TV. But
Hey,
anyways,
everybody's got their thing, but let's go into it, of course.
our 2024 Hall of Fame class, I can hear like the music playing behind me and Rich
Yeah.
Eisen announcing everybody. From the Indianapolis, mainly from the Indianapolis Colts, defensive end Dwight Freeney in his second year of eligibility. From mainly the Chicago Bears, but also played with Atlanta and Seattle for like 2 games. Um, Punt returner and return specialist, we might say, Devin Hester. From the U and eventually the Houston Texans. Andre Johnson, wide receiver. Uh, Roy Williams, maybe his best athlete of all time. Not Tyler Hansbrough. Julius Peppers, defensive end, played in Carolina,
I actually have
Chicago,
to
and Green
correct you.
Bay.
I don't think Roy Williams was at in Chapel Hill, but
Oh, he
at that
wasn't?
point, I think he was still at Kansas.
Oh.
Yeah, because
When did he take over in at UNC then?
like 2003.
Huh.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the guy's name. 2000 North
There's somebody
Carolina.
out there going, well, actually.
And I gotta no, because I gotta look that up now because that's gonna bother me.
While you're looking that up, um, middle linebacker from the San Francisco 49er, or he wasn't really a middle, he was an inside backer. Um, Patrick Willis. And then we had um, two senior additions to this year's class.
Matt
Middle
Doherty.
linebacker from who was it?
Matt Doherty.
Never even heard of him.
Yeah. So keep going. Sorry.
Randy Grisha, is it Grisher or Grishar? I think it's Grisher, right?
Uh, you talking about
From the Orange Crush.
Gradishar? Gradishar.
Gradishar. Okay. Randy
Sorry, I was behind in my
Gradishar.
notes.
That's okay. Randy, if you're listening out there, well, we're first of all, we are so happy that you would pick us
I
to
have a
listen to.
I have a lot of notes actually. Randy Gradishar was a really good player. So
He was.
yeah.
And
So
then
I'll go in. I'll
finally,
go through that.
defensive tackle from the 85 Bears, Steve Mongo McMichael. So that was your Hall of Fame class, a class of 7 players. And of course, with all Hall of Fame classes, there's a bit of controversy and who got picked and who didn't get picked. What we're going to do today is to go over that and go over each player's resume. What we are going to talk about is, and I don't want people to, uh, I love stats. Steven loves stats. We both love numbers, but we also want to talk about, we're going to use their numbers as comparison. But we don't want to make it sound like if a player's numbers, if a metric comes in below what his peers, his Hall of Fame peers might be, we're not necessarily saying he shouldn't be a Hall of Famer because we don't think that's true. Okay. Everybody, if you get to this point, if you're a finalist, you have a damn good argument to get into the Hall of Fame, I think. Would you agree with
Unless you're
that, Steven?
Jerome Bettis. I'm just kidding.
Well, yes, because Jerome Bettis shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame if it wasn't for Ben Roethlisberger tackling Nick Harper. Oh,
Congratulations on your like 3.6 yards per carry, but
di-
let's get started.
So let's start off with the pass rushers from this class. And so what we're gonna do is Pro Football Reference. Now this is available for everybody to see. Pro Football Reference has an awesome tool called Hall of Fame Meter. And they have for each position an average Hall of Fame meter, and they have some other averages. I don't know the correct calculations that play into the Hall of Fame meter, but it's a range of different statistics that they create, basically like a Z score. And that's how they determine like your not how Pro Football Reference would determine your Hall of Fame eligibility. Okay. Um, and so the other thing too, speaking of numbers, we need to remember too, people out there, that when we say average, we have to remember that there are people that are well ahead of the average. Okay. Because there has been some great players in NFL history. So if a player comes in below the average, it doesn't make them unworthy. Okay. It just means that they're probably like Dwight Freeney isn't as good as Reggie White. Breaking news. But
In certain
anyways,
positions, the Hall of Fame meter average. I mean, I wish Pro
it's
Football
skewed.
Focus would put the median instead of the
Yes, the
average
median
because
would be
like
better.
looks like Tom Brady's Hall of Fame meter
Well,
is like
well, like Jerry
300.
Rice is like 60
Yeah.
points ahead of the next receiver.
Yeah.
Like that's how
So,
amazing Jerry Rice was.
and if you have somebody that's an outlier at that level, or if, for example, if a player has such a low Hall of Fame meter on the flip side, I wish they had the median instead of the average, but the Hall of Fame meter is just kind of a gauge. It gives you kind of a quick glance to see, and my favorite use of it is to see where current players are. So,
Yes.
like for example, like the highest Hall of Fame meter at wide receiver for a current player right now is Tyreek Hill.
Yeah.
So,
The most
which make
recent
yeah,
highest, or for the most recent player that has the highest is Larry Fitzgerald, who will
yes,
get
yeah,
in very soon.
yeah. I guess we'll be covering him probably in like 1 or 2 years.
Yeah,
But
we'll
let's
probably
get
be at the Hall of Fame by then. So,
yeah,
anyways, um, for a defensive end, the average Hall of Fame meter is 104. The average, now there's a few other stats. The average championships won for a Hall of Fame defensive end is one. The average all pro teams is three. The average Pro Bowls is seven. The weighted approximate value. So, approximate value is another Pro Football Reference stat. Weighted is just a way to create more cohesion across eras. The weighted approximate value is 104. Games played on average 199. So that's like 12 and a half seasons, we'll
yeah,
say.
yep.
Games started 174, so about 11 seasons.
Most Hall
Um,
of Fame candidates are going to start most of the games they play, unless you're a
exactly.
specialist.
Right. Or like Donnie Shell we talked about last week. He didn't really start until he was like a fourth year in the league.
Yeah.
Interceptions, I only include this for a reason, and Steven, you'll talk about this later. The average interception for a Hall of Fame defensive end is three, with one pick six on average, and then the sacks is 127. Now,
Yeah.
Dwight Freeney, we're going to talk about him first. He's going to come pretty close to a lot of these metrics. His
Yeah.
Hall of Fame meter is about 19 points below the average. He's 85.22, so a little bit lower. However, he has the one championship from when the Colts won Super Bowl 41. He was a part of that team. He was a part of that defense that really, especially that defensive line that was much maligned throughout the regular season, and they turned it on big time in the playoffs. He was
Yeah. I
on
think we're good.
Oh, yeah, he was on. Well, I'll go through all the stats and then we'll spew.
Okay.
He was on three All Pro teams, seven Pro Bowl teams. His weighted approximate value was 81. Now that's about 23 lower. I think that's because he was playing on some pretty shitty defenses. I think you can attest that too.
Yes.
He played in 218 games. He had a long career. Um, was he in the 28-3 game?
He was. Yeah. He was on the Falcons that season, and he was on the Cardinals, I think, the year before. So, and we'll get into Freeney in a second where you finish the stats, but he has. I think a big thing that goes for him is that he was in a ton of big games
Yes,
and he had a lot of
absolutely.
playoff exposure, and that
Yeah,
helped, I
he
think,
sure
his
did.
cause with the voters.
And also, he didn't really like, I don't think he really took off, I should say, until his second year in the league, right? He was kind of quiet, I think, his rookie season. And then His second year was the year that he
No,
like he
he had 13 sacks as a rookie.
oh his Jesus
Yeah,
Christ.
I think Peppers is who you're thinking of, who took a.
Yes.
Peppers actually really took off his third year, but we'll get into Peppers in a little bit. But go ahead and finish up with Freeney.
And then the sacks, Dwight Freeney is only a sack and a half behind the average Hall of Fame sack leader. So
Yeah.
all things considered, like I said, the only beside the Hall of Fame meter, I think is brought down a lot by the weighted approximate value. But as I said, I think that's because he played on a lot of really bad teams, or not really bad teams, really kind of iffy defenses, we'll say. Um,
Yes.
Steven, I think he is totally, I think he earned his place in Canton. What do you think?
I mean, I would agree with him. I think he's a perfectly, uh, I think he's a perfectly average Hall of Famer. Like you
Yeah.
said, I mean, the thing that really, there's two cases I would give. I mean, you went over the statistics. He fits the profile of that. But I mean, one thing that just stands out to me is the amount of playoff games he was in. I mean, he was on
Hmm.
a bunch of Colts teams, and he almost revolutionized the position. Because before, you know, defensive ends were more of your Reggie White types. I mean, they
Yeah.
were guys that were closing in on 280, 285, 290. They were
Yeah.
these huge guys.
6'4", six
You know,
five.
occasionally you would see some 3-4 defenses run, some smaller outside linebackers but those Kevin Greens of the world were still 265,
Yeah.
270.
He was a monster,
But Dwight Freeney was like 6'1", 268. So he had the size in terms
which
of
is
girth,
it's
but
actually kind
6'1"
of
is
normal
tiny.
now. But
Yeah.
back then, like that was especially going up against the hog molly
Yeah.
offensive tackles.
Yeah,
He
because like
was.
the left tackles of the day that he would line up against were guys like Jonathan Ogden in
Hmm.
Baltimore.
Yep.
I remember seeing a clip of him uh, going crazy on him, I think, in a Sunday night game. And like
Yeah.
no one really got past Jonathan Ogden. I mean, he was arguably him and Orlando Pace were
Yeah.
the two left tackles of the 2000s where
He would have
there
gone
was
up
like,
against Joe Thomas a couple times.
yeah, later, yeah, like towards the middle part of his career. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, but he used, he kind of revolutionized the position to where you see a lot more, you know, less size speed freaks, more, he
Freelancing.
he's freelancing and he kind of made the spin move as an art form because I think so
Hmm.
many of these big lumbering left tackles, that big, long, you know, 6'7", 6'8" left tackles, they couldn't handle his burst off the line and then his agility because when you're so big, they can't handle that spin move. And he almost like you used to hear the analysts talk about it like no one taught spin moves because you weren't supposed to take your
No.
eye off the quarterback when you're a defensive lineman. He honestly like changed the way they do it now because he almost just went to the quarterback with a reckless abandon. He was going to get there any way he could, but he almost turned it into an agility game more than just a power game. Because when you, like I said, when you thought of defensive ends in the late 90s or the mid 90s or late 90s, early 2000s, they were these bigger guys, right? Freeney was different, but he had a thick lower body. And, but I think like his spin move was so special. Like when I was just watching his old tape, it reminded me like because you don't see guys that were that good at one thing. It almost
Hmm.
reminded me of like when Kareem had his sky hook
Yeah.
where he couldn't stop it.
Good
And like
analogy. Yeah.
yeah, and I think in a way it was very similar because the best left tackles in the game, they had a hard time keeping him out of the quarterback, keeping him away from the quarterback. And
Yeah.
Dwight Freeney to me, definitely a Hall of Famer. Now, the question we get at the end of the podcast is he better than some of the other guys that
Yeah.
weren't selected? That's a different question. But I think, yeah, he fits the profile. I can't argue against him making it necessarily.
Hmm. Yeah, I would agree with all that. The second defensive end that got into the Hall of Fame, I don't think there's much debate about this is
This was
Julius
easy.
Peppers. Yes. Julius Peppers had a 119.75 Hall of Fame meter score. That's 15.75 above the average. He did not win a championship, but he came close quite a few times.
Yeah.
With both of our teams once. And then he was in the Super Bowl in 2003 with the Panthers when
Yep.
they lost to Tom Brady for their second Super Bowl. Um, he was on 3 All-Pro teams. He was on 9 Pro Bowl rosters. His weighted approximate value was 130. And just like Freeney being a part of some poorer defenses, Pep would have been a part of some great defenses, but also he was a big part of that. Played in 266 games. He started 240 of them. Remember earlier when I said the average defensive end had 3 interceptions, a Hall of Fame defensive end?
Yep.
Julius Peppers had 11. He had 4 pick sixes and 159 and a half sacks, which is 32 and a half more than the average Hall of Fame defensive end.
He was an incredible player. And with
He was
Pepper,
the definition of a freak. Like,
yeah, when you would create a player in Madden,
yeah,
you couldn't even create Julius Peppers. Like it
no,
wouldn't let you in terms of like the arm length, the athletic ability for somebody
yeah.
his size. I mean, he had a basketball background. So there's this one play in college that I go back and watch this because he's like an alien where I think it's Curry for North Carolina ends up throwing him an alley-oop pass, and the just the hand-eye coordination for somebody that big is scary. And you can
Yeah.
see why you can see that he had that hand-eye coordination in the NFL because like you mentioned, he had 11 career picks as a defensive end. He is the only player in NFL history with 100 sacks and 100 sacks and 10 interceptions. 100 sacks, 10 interceptions.
I
He has 159 career sacks. So he doesn't just qualify for the 100 sack club. It's the 110 sack club with the 10 interception. Like he shatters the
yeah.
he's arguably I would say the most versatile pass rusher of all time.
And when we say he had 11 interceptions in his career, he wasn't like until Green Bay, when that was the first time in his career really he was standing up as a
Yeah.
pass rusher, wasn't he?
He
So
could have always stood up too. That
he
was
could
the
have
thing with
always stood up,
yeah.
and he might have had 25 interceptions if he
Yeah.
stood up, but he had his hand in the dirt for the first 12 years of his career.
Yeah.
I mean, and he still had that many interceptions. I
Yeah.
mean, um,
He was a special player and he had his combine measurements 6'6", 283, ran a 4.7. He's running
oh,
as fast as some of these running backs, like the slower end running backs, which is just
yeah,
crazy at that size. There was this play in Denver, or really a sequence of plays in Denver, where this guy chases down Jake Plummer on a bootleg. And remember, you're playing at a mile high.
yeah,
Very
gassed.
next, very next play, drops back in the coverage and then proceeds to return an interception 101 yards. Got chased down by Rod Smith at like the 3 yard line. It took Rod Smith basically 90 yards to catch him. Rod Smith was a wide receiver.
Yeah.
This guy was unbelievable. I mean, that isn't even the craziest play either. There was a play he had in Carolina when he was with the Bears. You probably
The,
remember this play.
the worst offensive game of all time.
He tips Jimmy Clausen's pass up in the air, and that's where his basketball skills come in. He finds the ball and like makes this acrobatic play. I still couldn't. I when I saw that, that's one of the greatest plays I've ever seen
He
by any
he
one football player.
his body was the his momentum of his body was taking him one way, and he literally dove back across his momentum to pick off the pass. I mean, it was insane. I
Yeah,
think Julius Peppers. I don't think. he was definitely unanimous in the Hall of Fame vote. Um, so it was he was most deserving, I think, of the entire class. I mean, every one of these guys is deserving, but I think Julius Peppers certainly is the most.
Yeah, and my last takeaway for Peppers is if the NFL has a 125th anniversary team, he should be on it.
Oh
That's
yes.
how good I think he was.
Well, we were talking earlier this week. He probably should have made the 100th anniversary team
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look who made it. Um, that's interesting because
because that should be like, that should you would
that was
think
the
that
end
would
of
have
his
popped up in
career.
his act. Yeah,
He had been retired already. But I
yeah,
mean,
he would
Reggie
have.
White's on there, and you got players from the 70s.
Yeah, and Bill, we love Bill on this show.
Yeah,
If you didn't know, but Bill knows his football, and he would have made sure that guys before 1960 were included. So
but he was
that
a
might have been a reason why.
yeah, he was just a playmaking defensive end. I mean, and one of the last plays I want to go over before we move on to the next player. There was a play in 2014 where Christian Ponder, it's a rainy Thursday night at Lambeau Field. Christian Ponder gets a ball tipped. Remember, tip drills, Julius Peppers is going to be around the ball. He intercepts this pass. He proceeds to run for a touchdown, but on his way into the end zone, he runs away from Jerick McKinnon. Jerick McKinnon was a running back, and he had just as much acceleration, if not more, than Jerick McKinnon in that play. I think he was at least 10 years into the league at that point. He was in his 30s by the
Yeah,
time that
at
happened.
least, yeah. He had already spent 4 years in Chicago, so
I mean, outside of Aaron Donald and maybe a handful of other players, he is truly one of the best players I've ever watched. Very
yeah,
underrated player.
most gifted. And he was very consistent. He was like he never led the NFL or in tackle or excuse me, in QB takedowns, but he certainly, he was at a steadying pace just about his entire career.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
that wraps up our DN talk. There was just those two guys. And really, I guess we'll bring it up later, but there was really no other defensive end that I think would have gotten a nod um,
Oh, I diskagree, but we'll get into that.
there was one. Yeah, I forgot about.
I
But
disagree, but
anyways,
yeah, we'll get into
uh,
that in a second.
the next position group we want to talk about are wide receivers. The first one that we'll talk about is the second one we included him, but the first one is certainly a deserving wide receiver. The average Hall of Fame meter for a wide receiver is 101. The average Hall of Fame wide receiver won one championship, two All Pro teams, six Pro Bowls, had a weighted approximate value of 94, played in 188 games, started 166, caught 742 balls for 11,000 yards and 86 touchdowns. The first wide receiver we'll talk about is Andre Johnson of the Houston Texans and the Colts. And was that it? I think so, yeah.
He played
Yeah.
for the Titans.
Oh, the Titans. That's right.
Yeah, he was on the Titans for his final season, I believe.
There was a few like NFC or AFC South players that kind of switched between team. Like Hasselbeck was on the Titans and the Colts.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was kind of weird there for a few years. The mid
Yeah, and
2000s, the
technically
mid
only played in the
2010s.
AFC. He only played in the AFC South. He never
Yeah,
left the
that
division.
weird. So Andre Johnson, his Hall of Fame meter was 91.91. Now again, that's below the average, but as we mentioned earlier, Jerry Rice is skewing the average for the Hall of Fame meter for wide receivers. So
It also hurts him. He played for the Texans like
yes.
in an era like he was I think the year after they were an expansion team. 03, they were I think 02 is when they started.
Yeah.
So for the first 4 or 5 years, he's not doing crap in January.
No,
So that's gonna hurt
never.
his Hall of Fame meter, and that's not his fault.
No. Um, of course, never a part of a championship team. He didn't even make an AFC championship. He got pretty close in 2011 and 2012. They were in the divisional playoffs both those years. They actually had some really strong teams, but they had Matt Schaub at quarterback,
Yeah.
and that wasn't enough to get over the hump. He was on two All-Pro teams. He made 7 Pro Bowl rosters, um, which is a huge accomplishment in itself. His weighted approximate value is exactly at the average, 94. Played in 193 games, started 187 of them. He caught 1,062 balls for 14,000 yards, and he scored 70 touchdowns, which is a little bit below the average.
Yeah. I mean, he honestly he had a really similar resume to a guy that will be first ballot in Julio Jones. I mean,
Yeah.
he's
Um,
he seems like a really solid Hall of Fame candidate. I mean, everything you
it's
see here
really
statistically.
cool for Houston, because I know Tony Baselli made it, so they might claim him as their first um,
That
Texan
is,
Hall of Famer,
yeah,
but he's not. He's a
come on.
Jaguar.
Yeah.
Um, so this is really the first Texan to make the Hall of Fame. He's certainly the best player in Texans history, I think. Well, now, no, he's not. He's the best offensive player in Texans history.
Yeah, JJ
I
Watt.
think
Yeah.
JJ Watt's definitely the best player. Um, but Andre Johnson for a few years there, like we were talking about those early um 2010s, early to mid 2010s, late 2000s, like from about 2009 to we'll say 2013, well actually 2012 because 2013 what was 2014 was the year they drafted Clowney, so 2013 they sucked. So, but from about 2009 to 2012, there was not a more dangerous receiver besides maybe Calvin Johnson in the NFL, Julio Jones included,
Yeah.
than
Well,
Andre
Julio was
Johnson.
really young. Julio Jones was still really young at that point.
Oh, he was,
Uh,
yeah, because he drafted
yeah.
in 2011.
Yeah,
But
it was, and because really like Randy Moss was starting, he
he was on
faded
the
at that
decline,
point. Yeah, and then T.O. was still actually producing, but not at the level he was when he
and he
was with,
wasn't playing on big
Philly or
teams
Dallas.
either.
Yeah, like T.O. in 2004 was not what T.O. was. He was a lot better in '04 than he was 2010. So Andre Johnson, yeah, I agree with you. At that point, it was really him and Calvin Johnson were arguably
Yeah.
the best receivers in the game. That era didn't last. I think Calvin kind of held that on for a little longer than Andre Johnson.
Yes. And
Um,
a lot of that was the quarterback. I mean, Matt Schaub,
yeah,
I got to give him his flowers. Like Matt Schaub, for as much as like Big Cat like used to make fun of him with that like I'm coming home when he signed back with Atlanta.
yeah,
It's a hilarious video. But he was pretty like he was really good at running the Kubiak offense. But like that offense, when it wasn't like Arian Foster was a huge part of that ground game, and they had
yeah,
a really good offensive line. But Andre Johnson was the thing that made those drives, those third down catches to keep those drives alive so that they could continue moving the ball with Arian Foster. He unfortunately, like we said, he never got to play in like an AFC championship. And even those 2 years that they were in the divisional playoffs, 2011, they gave Baltimore a good run for it, but they weren't going to beat. They had like TJ Yates at quarterback, so they didn't really have a chance. He's just one of those guys that he did his job for a long time and he did it very well. He wasn't flashy by any stretch of the imagination. Um, Actually, probably his most famous clip is when he beat Cortland Finnegan's ass,
yeah.
which I think all of America was pumped about.
It
So,
was. I mean, Finnegan was giving him the business like all
yeah.
game, and you could tell because I think the Texans were kicking the Titans' ass at this point. So Andre Johnson's like, "I'm done whooping your ass up and down the field, so I'm just gonna whoop your ass and just get kicked out the game." And I
Yeah.
think Kubiak gave him the game ball. That was the best part. I mean,
It really is.
everybody in the country outside of like Nashville loved that clip.
Oh yeah. It was like they were playing it on Sports Center for weeks. It was
Yeah.
hilarious.
Normally,
So
leagues don't condone fighting, but we like that one.
yeah.
Um, One of the things that I liked about his profile for Hall of Fame purposes is for any position I like to kind of cross reference and like that's literally the exercise we're doing is rating him by average Hall of Fame wide receivers. But of course, guys that played in the 70s are going to have lesser stats because they played in the dead ball era, or even guys that played in the 1950s or 1960s. But these are the guys that have 1,000+ career receptions and 14,000 passing yards with 70+ touchdowns. 10 guys: Reggie Wayne, Marvin Harrison, Steve Smith, Tim Brown, Tony Gonzalez, Isaac Bruce, Randy Moss, Terrell Owens, Larry Fitzgerald, and Jerry Rice. All but two of those players are Hall of Famers. So to
Yeah.
me,
Yeah.
Andre Johnson, pretty solid Hall of Fame pick.
Yeah. He is. He really, and actually, the other thing I did kind of say it at the beginning. He went to the U. He was on the greatest college football team of all time.
He was. He think about that passing attack, by the way. Ken Dorsey was pretty spoiled
He
because he's
was.
sitting there going to his right, he's got Andre Johnson. Going to
Hmm.
his left, he's got Reggie Wayne. Oh, and if you know, that doesn't work out, I'll just throw it to Jeremy Shockey.
Yeah. And then
Like
Kellen
that.
Winslow was a backup tight end.
What a
Uh,
stacked team.
I mean, unreal. Um,
Willis McGahee, I think, was around. Willis McGahee
yeah.
was there.
Jarrett
Clinton
Payton.
Portis. Yeah. What a
Yeah.
stacked team.
Yeah, they were. I mean, those were. That's actually that was when I first got into college football was
Yeah.
those years. So that was fun.
And
But so
don't forget
anyways,
the legend Najee Davenport, by the way.
oh, actually, there's another guy from that team. Oh no, he came later on. Forgot that.
Yeah.
Forgot about that. Anyways, the next wide receiver, technically, he's classified as a wide receiver that we want to talk about is Devin Hester. Now, disclaimer. We're going to talk about why we think Devin Hester is a Hall of Famer, but we're also going to bring up the points why some people might feel he shouldn't be a Hall of Famer.
We
Okay.
should just not even talk about his receiving. Like that doesn't. It doesn't
Yes.
matter.
I was, but yeah, it is funny though. His Hall of Fame meter, I'll just say this, is 48.4, which would be about 52, 53 less than the average. But he was not a wide receiver that we understand as a wide receiver. In fact, he actually, if he played in today's era, would probably make a very good wide receiver. Well, he'd
Yeah,
make a
possibly.
great like your jet sweep. He'd be great on bubbles. Like there'd be a good offensive coordinator, or a good offensive coordinator would know what to do with Hester. What
Yeah.
Hester became so famous for was his ability to return punts and then later on kicks. There was, and I don't think I truly do believe that Hester is a Hall of Famer because I don't think there's a return specialist outside of Cordero Patterson that was as impactful as Devin Hester. Devin Hester had 14 punt return touchdowns. He had 20 total returns. That includes 5 kicks and a missed field goal return. For somebody that is a Bears fan, that was at that 2006 Bears team. For anybody that's under the age of 40, really, in Chicago, that was the most fun year we ever had watching the Bears. It started in his debut game against Green Bay. He ran a punt back. Um, and then everybody remembers the week 6 game, the Monday Night Football game. The Bears are who we thought they were game. Uh, when the Bears did not score an offensive touchdown all game, they scored 2 defensive touchdowns on a Mark Anderson strip sack, and Mike Brown ran it in for a touchdown. Then Urlacher stripped Edgerrin James. Charles Tillman ran the ball in for a touchdown. So the Bears were getting the ball back with 2.5 minutes left in the game. And it was just like, okay, Rex Grossman, can you lead one touchdown drive? Please, dear God, Rex Grossman, lead one touchdown drive. And he didn't even have to because Hester took the punt at about a 17-yard line. He made two cuts and he was into the open. It's a game that is still talked about in Chicago. My personal memory of that game was well, the Bears went in 5-0, and the Cardinals were whooping the Bears' ass, and I was crying, um, just because I wanted to see how long they could stay undefeated for. Um, but also I was probably tired. I was a 10-year-old, 10 going on 11. And my mom was like, "All right, you know what? Let's get you to bed. Let's get you to bed." So she put me into bed. She put me in the bed in the middle of the third quarter. The Bears are down 23-3. The next morning, she woke me up for school and she said, "Neil, the Bears won." And I was like, "Okay, all right, okay, whatever. Yeah, you've done this before. Like, this is how you try to get me out of bed." And she was like, "No, really, they did." And I was like, "Okay, all right, whatever." I went into the kitchen. My mom always put the news on in the morning while we were eating breakfast. The morning news in Chicago, they talked about the traffic and the weather. There was no other news story, but did you see that game last night? Because that's how crazy it was. That was really the birth of Hester's mythological status in Chicago. Of course, then he had the missed field goal return a few weeks later. He had a return in the game they clinched the division against the Vikings. He did that 4 years later then. And of course, he had two against St. Louis in the Super Bowl return. In 2007, he picked up right where he left off. He went on a bit of a hiatus for a few years, uh, and while they tried to teach him how to play wide receiver, which he was not good at. He was okay at a 9 route every once in a while, but when the Bears finally got like Alshon and Marshall, they kicked him to the curb. Unfortunately, Cutler also didn't really target him a lot. I don't think he trusted him, which was
Yeah.
also maybe something that aided his poorer wide receiver stats. But then
Yeah.
in 2010, he had kind of a resurgence that again came against. I'm sure you remember that wild. It's one of the few victories the Bears have had against the Packers in the last 15 years. When
That game was such a
the Packers had 97 penalties.
that was a game that epitomized the 2010 Packers regular season where you watch that game, the Packers are better in
Oh
every
yeah,
phase of the game outside of penalties and special teams.
and Julius Peppers, ironically, he had a huge game that night.
And what happens? Bunch of penalties and a punt return touchdown by Devin
Yeah,
Hester.
they just kept the
Flips the
Bears in
game.
long enough. Yeah, and then
Yeah.
there was a fumble. James Jones, I think it was, got
Oh yeah, the ball
stripped.
doesn't go out of bounds.
The ball like tipped like this on the sideline and then rolled back into play.
If that
Um,
game is played on artificial turf, that ball goes out of bounds, but the Soldier Field grass is
there
like
was
the
a
thickest
divot
in the league.
probably.
Yeah. It's amazing. I've never been like, I knew we were going to lose that game once I saw that happen because I go, there's nothing you can do there.
No, you couldn't.
The
But
the thing about Hester, do you want to finish your thoughts on him
no,
first?
I'll just say this. It's really cool. I know he was on I know a lot of people were like, like you can't like put a return specialist in. And I think you're gonna make a good point about this. I always thought Hester was very deserving. I know his receiver stats didn't look good, but there was really nobody, I think, that impacted the game from his position. I mean, we're talking like he was the elite of the elite. There's a guy that writes he's a Bears blogger named Jonathan Wood, and in 2017 he actually just rehashed this piece the other day. He put together an article with statistics about just how great Hester was and just how much impact he had. And I would recommend anybody to read it because it really does show what Hester did to change the NFL.
Yeah, and I'll give my quick thoughts on Hester. What he was really special about, like you said, he was a below average, like below replacement level wide receiver. Like I throw that part of his resume completely out. Like I
Yeah.
am only looking at Devin Hester as a specialist. There are specialists in the Hall of Fame. You know, you have Ray Guy, he's in the Hall of Fame.
Hmm.
You have a couple of kickers, right? Place kickers. Adam Vinatieri's going to make it in when he's eligible. So I don't have it. I don't have a problem putting Devin Hester in because he is the best return man of all time. And I'm good with that. I'm good with him making it. A lot of people dispute that. Now, would I put him over some of the guys that were not inducted this year? That's debatable. I think that's a fair debate. But I think
Yeah.
Devin Hester is totally deserving of top consideration. And I have no problem with him being chosen in this class. What he did, though, and the impact that he made on a game, I felt like it was even more substantial with the Bears because they didn't have very efficient quarterbacks
No.
really at all like, during his entire career.
No.
Maybe when Cutler got there, but even then, he wasn't awesome, right?
Right.
So he gets there. Every single punt return he had, I feel like it flipped the game back. It was a game a lot of the times where like the Bears couldn't pull away, or the Bears were behind in the game, or they were even down two scores, and he'd bring them back. He basically give them a free score and get them
Yeah.
right back in it. Gives them a free possession. It's just as valuable as Charles Woodson taking a pick six back. And we
Yeah.
value that enough to put that in the Hall of Fame. I have no problem with Devin Hester getting in the Hall of Fame on one condition that we need to start including more specialists. And I think
Yes.
maybe having every 5 years have a category made for specific specialists because you want to be able to recognize the top long snappers, punters, kick returners, and then even guys like Steve Tasker that were just gunners,
Yeah.
right? Made
We're
impactful
the guys to
plays.
do that, Steven, I
Yeah.
think.
But I think that's my problem though with Hester is he's going to get in and I get it because he's a very famous player and this is the Hall of Fame.
Hmm.
But I don't think guys like Steve Tasker or Matthew Slater are ever going to get the Canton. And I have a little bit
Yeah.
of a problem with that because I think they had just as much of an impact on their teams, especially Matthew Slater, and because he won a bunch of Super Bowls, and Steve Tasker got to a bunch of Super Bowls, and I think they were big contributors to their team's success. They're not going to see the recognition that Devin Hester got. That's my only
Yeah.
issue. But it's not even an issue with Devin Hester. It's more of an issue with the
The
way
process.
the process is very inconsistent when you
Yeah.
look at like certain guys, and I think it helps that he played in Chicago.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah. If he
I think
played for the Titans,
he's not getting in. Cordero
yeah.
Patterson's going to see that. Like Cordero Patterson's breaking records for kickoff returns. He ain't
But
gonna
he did
sniff
it with
Canton.
4 different teams. Yeah.
Yeah, he's not gonna
Um,
sniff Canton.
it would be
Uh,
cool if Hester, and the last point we'll make, it'd be cool if Hester actually championed those guys. Like now that he is in the Hall of Fame,
yeah,
if he, over the course of time said like, hey, let's get Steve Tasker, let's get Cordero Patterson, let's get Adam Vinatieri, those kind of guys. It would be really nice.
you can't tell the story of football without special teams. I mean,
Yes.
that's the third phase of the game.
Special
So
teams was a huge reason why Kansas City won the Super Bowl the other night.
yeah.
So,
And the best of the best of that at those positions deserve every bit of the recognition as
absolutely.
defensive and offensive players. But let's go on to Patrick Willis.
Patrick Willis. So anyways, for inside linebackers, because we're going to have two different inside linebackers to talk about. The
Yeah,
average Hall of Fame meter is 106. The average Hall of Fame inside linebacker has won one championship. The other thing I kind of like about that too, and this is what we talked about last week, it says championship. It doesn't say Super Bowl. So for any of you people out there, the Pro Football Reference also recognizes NFL championships, just like your favorite podcast, the Old Souls Football Podcast, available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Amazon Music. The average Hall of Fame inside linebacker has made 4 All-Pro teams, 7 Pro Bowls. They have a weighted approximate value of 103. They've played in 167 games, starting 159 of them, 21 interceptions. It's important to be a somebody that's around the ball as an inside linebacker. 1 pick six, 21 pass deflections, which that's a tough stat to use because they didn't start like there's really no evidence of pass deflections for guys that were beyond like say 1994 when they don't have as much play-by-play uh,
Yeah.
data. And then lastly, sacks with 22, which is also a little bit difficult for an inside linebacker. Patrick Willis, he has a Hall of Fame meter of 107.1, which is higher than the average. Now that's important because the Hall of Fame meter is a um, volume statistic. Okay, so it's additive. So it's like you start off at 0 and you add on to it as your career goes on. Um, so well, obviously they have their own calculation, but they take whatever you did for this year and they add it on to what you had your previous years. That's incredible that he had a 107.1 Hall of Fame meter because Patrick Willis only played 7 full seasons in the NFL. So he did basically have a Hall of Fame career in quite less than a decade. He was on 5 All-Pro teams. He made the Pro Bowl every single year he played in the NFL. His weighted approximate value was 93. That's brought down a little bit because he played on some pretty harsh teams in the first half of his career. And then he kind of blossomed later on. He had 8 interceptions, not a heck of a lot, but a decent amount. 2 pick sixes, 53 pass deflections, which is just as good as an interception in some case. Well, not just as good, but can be. And he had 20 and a half sacks. Steven, you've had a real love for Patrick Willis since his playing days started. What do you
He's
think
been
of his candidacy?
This was the second easiest pick for me. When I go through my ballot, Peppers was my number 1 choice. Patrick Willis was my number 2. And it wasn't that hard because ultimately, look at his resume. Like you
Yeah.
said, he was in the league 8 years and he
Or
was
yeah,
an all
technically, yes, he did miss 1 year. Yeah, I forgot about that.
Patrick Willis was Patrick Willis was in the league for 8 seasons and he was the best at his position or an all pro, first team all pro 5 times.
It's
That
incredible.
he that's an easy sell for Canton.
Yeah. I mean,
I
yeah,
don't
the majority of your career, you're in the top 4 players at your position. Yeah, you're in.
Yeah. And he's in it. It's an important position. He was on good teams with Jim Harbaugh as the coach. One of the thoughts that I had, and this is, we both agreed, Patrick Willis is a Hall of Famer. It's not that hard. And the other thing about Willis, by the way, one of my last points on him, impactful immediately. Comes in as
Yeah.
a rookie out of Ole Miss, first round pick, immediately the best player at his position in the league. This is a league, by the way.
174 tackles.
This is a he came into the league. Ray Lewis and Brian Urlacher are still playing, by the way,
Yeah.
and
At
he
high
was
levels.
just as good, if not better,
Yeah.
than Ray Lewis and Brian Urlacher. Slam dunk Hall of Famer. I'm surprised he had to wait, to be honest.
He did
Um,
have a long wait. He was kind of the bridesmaid about 4 times before this. So it's really awesome that he was able to break through this year.
I the my going back to my original, like I was gonna make kind of a what if scenario.
Yeah.
What if Trent Baalke is not like the worst front office guy in the league and drives Jim Harbaugh away to Michigan?
Yeah.
And basically, I think that forced Patrick Willis into retirement and
It did.
kind of
He
broke up
left.
that
Yeah.
core. I mean,
It really did because it went to hell in a handbasket for San Francisco
he could have
until
played probably,
Shanahan took over
yeah, he could have played another 5, 6 years easily
easily.
and probably at a high level. And I mean, Ray Lewis, I think, played for, what was he, the 90, what was Ray Lewis, the 96 draft?
97, 96 or 97.
He was the 96 draft. So,
96, yes.
yeah, so
And he
he
lasted till
retired.
2012.
Yeah, he played 16 seasons. So if Patrick Willis plays 16 seasons, he would have retired after this season.
Excuse my
He,
coughing, anybody listening, by the way. I have a cold.
so that was one of my big what ifs. He retired nearly 10 years ago. He could have been playing just this year. Like
Yeah, he could have.
he could have
At
still been playing.
least he could have at least been a part of like that 49ers team that was in the Super Bowl a few years ago against Kansas
Yeah.
City. You know?
If he does, he could really be considered up there with like Butkus, Nitschke, Ray Lewis,
Yeah.
Lambert,
Well, see that's
some of
the
these
thing about
greatest linebackers of all time.
that Hall of Fame meter. Like I said, it's additive. He had that like he surpassed the average Hall of Famer in just really like he was in the league for 8 years, but he only had 7 seasons worth of games.
Yeah.
Um, like that's incredible. Like even imagine if he didn't miss a season's worth of games, like he'd be even higher.
Trying to
You
think of a
know,
player that had that sort of like who would be a comparable player that had that short of
Terrell
a
Davis,
yeah.
Gale
And
Sayers,
yeah, those two at running back, it's a little more common because those guys
yes,
tend to break down a lot easier or earlier. And
but they're also in the spotlight more. Like
yeah,
Willis, I mean, outside of hard-nosed football fans, um, like how many of your average NFL fans knew who Patrick Willis was before Jim Harbaugh took over and he
yeah.
brought Vic Fangio with him? Tells you also how good Vic Fangio is.
And I'll tell you this, when Patrick Willis came into the league, it was very uncommon for rookies to make impacts because between 2000 to 2007, only one other player had accomplished first team All Pro as a rookie that wasn't a specialist. And that was Jeremy Shockey in 2002 with the Giants.
Wow.
So he comes in, he's first team All Pro. That was really rare at that point in time. It's become a little more common. Like we saw two of the Jets do it last year.
Yeah,
Because Sauce Gardner, I think, was an All Pro.
he was.
Um, so
He
you
was
do
again
see it a
this
little,
year too.
yeah, you see it a little bit now, but when
Hmm.
he came into the league and he's the best at his position, where you still have Brian Urlacher and Ray Lewis, he's awesome, and he was awesome his entire career. No brainer for me.
Yeah, we're
Um,
very happy for Patrick
should
Willis.
have should have been in already, honestly. But
Long time ago.
yeah,
Our next inside linebacker that we're going to talk about is the man that I butchered his name early on. And again, if he's listening, we're very happy he's listening, but we're very sorry. Randy Gradishar,
he's
inside linebacker.
you'll want to keep getting his name wrong because he's an Ohio State legend. So
Oh
you'll
yeah,
he's
screw
like one
him
of the
then.
best.
Actually,
Woody Hayes called him his. Woody Hayes said he was his best player ever. So
really,
mhm.
no kidding.
Yep.
Um,
But keep going. Sorry.
So, anyways, Randy Gradishar's Hall of Fame meter was 66.8, which is technically 40 below the Hall of Fame meter, the average Hall of Fame meter for a inside linebacker. Again, we talked about this earlier today. That does not mean we don't think he is a Hall of Fame player. We'll talk more about that. He was never a part of a championship ball club. However, he did play in a Super Bowl. He played in Super Bowl, was it Super Bowl 11, right, Stephen?
Super
Against
Bowl 12
Super Bowl 12 against
against
Dallas. They
Dallas.
they did get their asses kicked, but I mean the Broncos, they had who was it? Chris Morton? Not Chris no, Chris Morton
Craig
on
Morton.
ESPN. Craig Morton.
That
Yeah,
Chris
sorry.
Morton's, yeah, but I think in Super Bowl 12 they had 8 turnovers on offense
Yeah, I mean they were
or 6 turnovers. Excuse
th-
me.
they never had like their Super Bowl was beating the Raiders in the AFC Championship. Like that was like they were really the first like Cinderella team to make the Super Bowl.
I was right the first time. It was 8 turnovers in one game for the
Eight
Broncos.
turnovers. He was on 2 All-Pro teams, 7 Pro Bowl teams, which is the average, and it's as many as Patrick Willis was on. His weighted approximate value. Now, this is the interesting one. His weighted approximate value is 88, which is actually only 5 below Patrick Willis. He played in 145 games. So this was an era where he was only a part of the 16-game season for the last 5 years of his career. He started in 133 of them. He had 20 interceptions and 3 pick-sixes. Pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
And he had 19 and a half sacks. Most famously, Randy Gradishar was a part of the renowned Orange Crush defense that dominated the AFC West during the 70s and the early part of the 1980s. He played alongside TJ from you're supposed to say Louisville.
Louisville. Yeah. It's been
Let's try
so
that
long
again.
since I've watched primetime, man.
TJ from Louisville. No, Randy Gradishar is, I think, a very deserving honor. The Hall of Fame meter, especially for guys that played in the 70s, and really obviously we talked about this not too long ago. The modern era in the NFL is considered from 1970 on post merger. But really, the game is so far different now than it was back then. There wasn't mostly what Randy Gradishar was doing was plugging holes. He was not, we'll say, freelancing like a Brian Urlacher was at middle line, even though Brian Urlacher was playing, the deep middle in the Tampa 2, but it was a totally different position. It was a totally different game back then. But Randy Gradishar was a player that he was a senior finalist. He had a long time waiting to get into the Hall of Fame. We're really excited for him. Steven?
Yeah. So I think the number one takeaway I have from Gradishar's career is that it was overshadowed, just like the 70s Broncos teams. Because you're playing in an era where you have the steel curtain, and I feel like just the front 7 had a half dozen Hall of Famers.
Yeah.
You have the Doomsday defense in Dallas. And in the early 70s, you have the no-name defense in Miami. The Orange Crush defense, I looked before Gradishar, no Hall of Famers. However, from 1976 to 1979, the Broncos were no worse than the 6th best defense in the NFL if you look at yards per play, which we don't have DVOA or anything to look back on.
This is the closest thing.
Yeah, I look at yards per play because that, to me, that's very similar. I look at a per play metric.
Yeah.
And the thing about the other thing the Broncos didn't have is they didn't have any like postseason glory. Like they made Super Bowl 12, so they didn't make the big game. But Dallas had a couple of Super Bowls in the 70s. Miami had a couple of Super Bowls. Pittsburgh had 4. Like, and the Oakland had one at that point. They ended up winning. I guess they didn't win another one until the 80s. They had one with Madden. So looking at Denver, this team feels a little overshadowed from history. But if you actually dive into his resume, it's pretty good. It's really good. I think it's a borderline Hall of Fame discussion. I don't think he does not have the resume of a Patrick Willis where he has like 5 first team All Pros in the 10 years that he played.
Right.
I think he had a couple of first team All Pros in there. I believe he had 2. So solid resume, looking at the awards, looking at the statistics. But I think really what I look at is if you put him on a team that wins a championship. If he had won Super Bowl 12, he's gonna make the Hall of Fame 20 years ago.
Yeah. Or he retired after Elway's rookie season. If he
Yeah.
stays on a little bit longer with Elway, does he, you know,
Yeah. Yeah. I think, and going back to Super Bowl 12, you even mentioned it. They played pretty well in that game. Like
yeah.
this defense played well in big games. It's just they gave up 8 turnovers on offense. They had
Hmm.
8 giveaways. That's an awful performance offensively.
Yeah.
And that gave the Doomsday defense kind of an added aura, right? And the Orange Crush defense of the 1970s, I don't think got its recognition until Randy Gradishar finally got in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
I think I think overall it's a borderline Hall of Famer, but the fact that he's getting in, I don't have a problem with it. Uh, I, it's right there. It's not the most impressive resume I've ever seen. I wouldn't put it up there with the robbery of like how Jerry Kramer was somehow left off
Yeah.
the Hall of Fame until he was like 75 years old. But I think Gradishar's deserving. I have no problem with it with him.
Yeah.
I would have voted yes if I had a vote.
And that leaves us with one final Hall of Fame inductee for it was a smaller class, only 7 players, which they can have as usually as many as 9. Well, usually the number is 8, but they could have as many as 9, but they went with 7 this year. The last Hall of Fame inductee that we'll talk about today is Steve Mongo McMichael, who is a defensive tackle. So to talk about the average defensive tackle, the Hall of Fame meter is 102. The average Hall of Fame defensive tackle was a part of 1 championship ball club, 4 all pro teams, and 7 Pro Bowl teams. They had a weighted approximate value of 103, played in 190 games, starting 175 of them, and had 92 sacks. Now, Steve Mongo McMichael had a Hall of Fame meter of 60.18, which outside of Devin Hester, who technically we put in as a receiver, would be the lowest of the class in the for the 2024 class. He was a part of 1 championship ball club, the 1985 Bears. He was on 2 all-pro teams, 2 Pro Bowl teams. But Mongo had a weighted approximate value of 100, which is just a little bit below the average of 103. Mongo played in 213 games, starting 171 of them. And Mongo had 95 sacks, which is the 3rd most for any defensive tackle ever. Um, as a Bears fan, I think a lot of people, especially say younger people, were excited for Devin Hester because he was the epitome of entertainment for us growing up. As you said, he was our offense. But if for anybody who has any um, memory of the 1985 Bears or those 80s Bears teams in general, or just for anybody that values those teams, like myself, obviously I was 10 years from being born when the Bears won the Super Bowl, but I've watched every single game from that 85 team over and over. I've studied them a lot. If you listen to the other Hall of Famers that Steve McMichael played with, Richard Dent, who is a defensive end for the Bears, Dan Hampton, who is a tackle alongside McMichael, and then kicked out to end when William Perry came in to play tackle. Mike Singletary, who played right behind Mongo's ass for 10 years. They would all tell you that Steve McMichael should have been in the Hall of Fame years ago. And you might say, well, yes, that's their That's their teammate. Of course, they're going to back him up. If you talk to guys like Russ Grimm, who played against Mongo in the playoffs in some hard-nosed NFC games back in the 80s, he would tell you that Mongo should have been in the Hall of Fame years ago. Joe Jacoby would say the same thing. And that's actually coming from Dan Pompei, who was a part of the Hall of Fame voters. I heard him saying that the other day on 670 The Score here in Chicago. C. McMichael retired in 1994, so he would have been eligible in 1999. Now, he was not a first ballot Hall of Famer by any stretch of the imagination, but he very well should have made the Hall of Fame long before this. The sad thing about this is that Mongo right now, for anybody who doesn't know, is battling ALS, and it's not the early stages. Mongo is 3 years into this battle, or almost 3 years. He is, I recommend anybody watching the Sunday NFL Countdown uh, piece on Steve McMichael there the other day before the Super Bowl. It was very well done, and it captured everything that was amazing about McMichael because he wasn't just a great player, he was the best character maybe on that team, on a team full of characters. He got cut from New England because he was in the I guess the combat zone in Boston, which is like their red light district, um, on nights before practices, before games. So he didn't fit in well there. And so he got signed for, I think, like $100 by the Bears, and he found a home in Chicago. He's from Texas, but he is truly an adopted son of Chicago. Um, he, after his NFL career was over, he joined WCW. He was part of the Four Horsemen with Ric Flair. Um, And so Mongo has made friends and has made impressions. Heck, he even ran for mayor of Romeoville, Illinois, about 20 years ago, so that he could put a strip club in the basement of his restaurant. Mongo was just the ultimate character, but he was a good guy from all accounts. He is unfortunately going through a battle that you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. And the pictures of him the last few days have been really comforting to know that he knows that he's in, but it's a shame that he couldn't be of his, you know, healthy self to enjoy it. But I think a lot of people in Chicago, his teammates, his wife, Misty, his sister, their nurses, everybody that's helped out. The Chicago Bears have done a lot for him. I think everybody's going to try to do their best to live up that what he really should have been in a long time ago. It's really awesome. I think a lot of people were afraid that a Ron Santo type thing was going to happen. Ron Santo should have been an MLB Hall of Famer or a baseball Hall of Famer, I should say. For years, they put him in after he died. This was kind
Yeah.
of bad enough that Mongo had to get to this point. I don't know if he'll see the induction in August, and he wants to go to the induction, but they don't know what that would do to him.
Yeah.
Um, so
It's a really sad
it's
situation with
it's
his
a very
ALS for
sad
sure.
situation, but you know, regardless, talking about the player, I know a lot of people said that were maybe a little bitter, some sad people out there, because there are some people like that that felt that it was only a pity vote. Again, as I said early on, Mongo was a totally deserving player. His job was to take on double teams in that 46 defense. And Dan Hampton and Richard Dent, who were athletic freaks of their time, were just told to get to the quarterback any way you can. And Mongo, so he didn't get the glitz and glamour that his two teammates did, and he still ended up with 95 sacks in his career. Um, would he have produced that way in another defense? maybe not, but the fact that he still produced that volume in a defense that had other Hall of Famers on it that were taking away his sacks, I think is pretty astounding. Um, Mongo to me is the one that, like when Hester got in, I was happy. I was almost in tears knowing that Steve McMichael was in. It is a beautiful thing for him.
Yeah.
I think he's very deserving.
Yeah, I would have given him a vote for yes, especially being in the senior category. Um, to me, what stood out, especially when I see D tackles when they're sitting there with 80 plus sacks, I think his career with the 85 Bears, or really the 1980s Bears, number one being on the greatest defense of all time, that's a plus.
Whoa,
I think
whoa.
what I think what honestly happened though with him is just the same thing that happened to Jerry Kramer,
Yeah.
where not necessarily the best player on an all-time team. So, he's stuck playing with Richard Dent, Dan Hampton, Mike Singletary, right? Those
Hmm.
three, like when you think of the 1985 Bears defense, those are
Those
the
are the
guys you
first
think of.
three. Yeah.
Yeah. And those guys are like sitting there, Mongo has two first team all pros. These guys have like five. So
Yeah.
I think it's a case where sports writers are like, oh, well, we've done the 85 Bears already. They're
Yeah.
taken care of. And I think that McMichael, he just kind of gotten forgotten.
Yeah.
And, I think he was a really, he was a Hall of Fame player. I would put him just like in the kind of the Gradishar category. Like he was really, really, really good, but kind of forgotten because Gradishar being in the 70s, like linebackers at that point, like there were some all-time players like Jack Lambert, for example, like in the Steel Curtain. Same thing with McMichael. You're just kind of, I think he was almost a victim of his own team and his own era. But if you look at his resume, I can't argue with 95 sacks from a defensive tackle. Like that's
Yeah.
impressive. And to me, just seeing that alone, that's good enough to get you in the Hall of Fame. If Geno Atkins is going to be up for debate here soon, and people are going to vote for him. And I think he has just as I would vote for McMichael and Geno Atkins.
Yeah. They're similar
His hard,
resumes.
yeah, and interior defensive linemen are tough because like outside of like unless you know what you're watching with the run game, you don't necessarily know what you're looking at. But
Yeah.
he was a disruptive defensive player. But I want to go into my ballot, and then I'll let you do
Yes.
yours. So I did uh I did my five. My five were Julius Peppers,
Yep.
Patrick Willis,
Okay.
Jared Allen,
Oh.
Jari Evans,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Wow.
Antonio Gates. Those were my five current players. I also gave a yes for Gradishar, Steve McMichael, and then we'll finish up the podcast. We'll talk about Buddy Parker for a second. But I
Okay.
gave those three yeses because the senior category and the contributors are just yes or no's. While the current era is you vote for the five.
Yes.
Peppers, Patrick Willis, Jared Allen, Jari Evans, and Antonio Gates. How about you?
So I'm with you on the yes for the senior guys. And then my five that I picked were um now it's a little bit offensive heavy.
Okay.
I went with Pep. I think Patrick Willis is totally deserving, but he wasn't one of my five because, like I said, I went very offense
Okay.
heavy.
Okay.
Darren Woodson is the only other defender that I have.
Huh.
I think he's
Interesting.
very deserving.
Interesting.
And then my three offensive players are one of them the same as you, Antonio Gates, who I think I actually he desperately deserved to be a first ballot Hall of Famer.
Yeah.
I think that was a travesty that he didn't get in this year. That's why I don't understand why they only did seven. I don't know why they didn't do nine. There was a few guys very deserving.
Because
And
I think the
then
current era they can only do five, right?
Oh, maybe that's what it is.
Yeah. So I think it
Oh,
just for the senior category, they just only had two that they were voting on.
okay. So
So
that's what it is. And then I went with Torrey Holt and Reggie Wayne. Especially Reggie Wayne, I think was very deserving of making the Hall of Fame. We talked about Reggie Wayne a lot during our first episode when we discussed the 2003 AFC Championship. I think Reggie has all the accolades that you would ever want a receiver to have. Um, in fact, I think Andre Johnson of the receivers who did now, um, he is part of that 70 touchdown, what was it, 1,000 yard and 14,000 or 1,000 catch, 14,000 yard um stat you brought up earlier, right?
yeah.
But in that, I think Reggie Wayne was in there. I think he deserved to make it over Andre Johnson. I think Andre Johnson should see the Hall of Fame at some point, but I wouldn't have put him in over Reggie Wayne. And I think Torrey Holt has waited a long time. I think he deserves to get into.
Yeah. And I'll go over why I think Jared Allen is
Oh
actually more
yeah.
deserve. I think he's more deserving than Dwight Freeney. And most people would disagree with me on that, but I've seen Jared Allen play a lot of football.
Yes.
Being a Green Bay fan, you've been the same, like
Yep.
NFC North guy. Hard to argue against four-time first team All Pro. He had 8 10+ sack seasons. In 2011, he had a 22 sack season, which would have been the record at the time, if not for Favre giving a bullshit record to Michael Strahan.
I
Let's be
know.
honest.
I'll
Like,
never forget that.
like Jared Allen had a legitimate record,
He
and then
literally went into the fetal position.
it's been broken since. But I mean, because I think it was T.J. Watt broke it. But
Yeah.
he was also just an amazing character. Like you either loved Jared Allen, like if you were a Viking fan or even a Chiefs fan, like you loved Jared Allen. But if you were like going up against him and he was wrecking your offense,
Hmm.
you freaking hate that guy.
Yeah.
Like, and because he would do the cowboy stir up, like, and oh
Ah.
man, but what a great celebration!
It
Like,
was a great celebration. Remember when he
yeah,
did that when he got a safety on Rodgers on Monday Night
yeah,
Football? And like the
yeah,
Metrodome that night was one of the loudest stadiums I've ever heard. They were rocking, and he was feeding off the crowd that night.
yeah. And my favorite Jared Allen moment was when he's basically laughing at Dan Orlovsky for running out of the back of the end zone. Like everybody like makes fun of Orlovsky for running out of the back of the end zone. But the funniest part of it is Jared Allen's literally like
Literally
doing going like,
pointing.
"Oh my god, I can't believe
Yeah.
you did it!" Like, and he was such a great pass rusher and so intimidating. Like that a professional quarterback ran out of the back of the end zone.
Yeah.
Like he had that type of presence. To me, I think he was a better player than Dwight Freeney, and that's why I picked him over. I think Dwight Freeney has a Hall of Fame resume too, but if I had to pick five, I'm picking Jared Allen over Freeney. Jari Evans, you got to show love to offensive linemen.
Yeah.
They're under recognized,
And
right?
I didn't have one of them. I probably deserve to put somebody like
Yeah.
that in there.
It's really hard to argue about interior linemen though, because there's not really any stats to go off of outside of all pro teams and Super Bowls and like postseason success.
Yeah.
Jari haven't he had that. He won a Super Bowl with the '09 Saints, and he was a four-time first team All Pro.
Yeah.
That to me is enough to get you in. But he was also on a Saints team. He came in out of Bloomsburg College, so he was a Division II player. But he comes in. He comes in. I think he was undrafted as well. He comes in '06, so he's right there at the very beginning of the resurrection of the Saints franchise. To me, he's just as vital of a player in that era as people that remember Marquez Colston, Reggie Bush, like those players, the supporting players. He's probably more valuable, honestly, because he was this team was such a big screen team through the Sean Payton era think about how many screen passes they ran. I mean, even with Kamara later on, Jari Evans didn't play with Kamara, but
Yeah.
you had Reggie Bush, Darren Sproles, Pierre Thomas.
Yep.
You can't have that without the right guards being in the right spot, making the blocks downfield, and playing within timing and executing. And Jari Evans was always there. I think he's a deserving vote. And what I worry about with him a little bit is that he's going to get forgotten about because in future classes we're about to see Brady, Gronk, Drew Brees, Antonio Brown, Eli, Larry Fitzgerald, J.J. Watt. They're all
Yeah.
coming, and those guys are going to all get in. Like
Yeah, that
I'm
always makes
worried.
me upset when I think about that stuff, you know?
Yeah, because I think Jari Evans is just gonna kind of get forgotten about. Uh, so that's to me, and I always thought he was the best guard in football for like a 5 or 6 year period. If you want to compare a player that's still playing right now, think of Zach Martin. And Zach Martin will get in the Hall of
Yeah.
Fame because he's a Cowboy. But Jari Evans is every bit as deserving and was every bit as good as Zach.
Yeah.
And then you and I both agree on Antonio Gates. Uh,
Yeah, a true, like I said, a true travesty that he didn't make the Hall of Fame. I don't really know what held him out. Um, I mean, the Hall of Fame even voted him. I know it's not the Hall of Fame isn't the one who puts somebody in. Um, but he's on the Hall of Fame all 2000s team,
yeah,
8 Pro Bowls, 3 All-Pros. In terms
yeah,
of the Hall of Fame meter, he's right up there with Tony Gonzalez. He's right up there with Gronk.
yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, he's
Yeah,
going to get in, but
he won four straight first team all pros from
yeah,
'04 to '07. Tony Gonzalez was still playing at that point.
yeah,
Tony Gonzalez, I think his last year was 2012. So
yeah,
there was really, to me, looking at his resume, there was really no reason to keep Antonio Gates out. I didn't understand that.
yeah.
Um, and
I think that's the
I
most surprising.
yeah, and the guys that, and I'll just kind of finish up here, and I'll let you kind of have your closing thoughts after this. I just want to kind of go down the list of all of these players that were on here. Um, Guys I left off who I think are very deserving, but I just didn't have them in my top five. Devin Hester, Dwight Freeney, Andre Johnson, and Darren Woodson. I think they're Hall of Famers. I just didn't have them ranked in the top five of my ballot. Guys I'm not sure on: Reggie Wayne, Rodney Harrison, and Willie Anderson. Those are the guys that like, because I looked more into Reggie Wayne's like total profile. The problem that I have is it's very like it's kind of with Steve Smith and Torrey Holt. So if you let Reggie Wayne
Yeah,
in, you have to start making arguments for Torrey Holt and Steve Smith, who aren't even
yeah,
really getting considered very much. And then they don't necessarily have the all pro selections either. And I really look at that because an all pro selection is so important
yeah.
because
It's
it
similar
shows,
people that are voting for the All
yeah,
Pro.
yeah, it's consistent with that. And then number two, like we're gauging, were you the best player at your position at any given time? Because if you're not getting a lot of first team all pros, you were never really the best at your position. And to me, the Hall of Fame should be a very exclusive club
Hmm.
of the best players. Like I love a lot of football players in turn, like loved watching them, but these guys I don't necessarily see as Hall of Famers. I think like they're the Hall of Very Good. Like they were awesome, had maybe one or two all pro seasons, but I don't think they have the resumes. Eric Allen, Torrey Holt, and Fred Taylor. And especially Fred Taylor.
Oh God, Fred Taylor.
Because yeah, I like Fred Taylor. I thought he was a really good player for Jacksonville. And
Not even close to being a
no,
Hall of Famer.
no, because if
Yes.
yeah, if you vote for Fred Taylor, then you need to put Sean Alexander, Priest
Yeah.
Holmes, Jamal Lewis, and every good running back, halfway good running back of the
Yeah.
2000s. Um,
Yeah,
you,
I didn't understand. I saw a couple people, like a few people on Twitter saying, "Oh, I thought Fred Taylor should have gotten in," and I was like,
it's
"Are
because they
we?" And
remember him.
I had to like think for a second. I was like, "Wait, was he better than I actually thought?" And he wasn't.
No,
He
he was
wasn't any
really
better than I thought.
what he had going for him is he played for a long time. He had like 13-year career, which is really a long career for a running back.
Yeah.
So he had that going for him, but like I said, I mean, you'd have to make a case for a guy like I'd rather look at Jamal Lewis, Sean Alexander, Priest Holmes, guys that had shorter primes but were the best players at at the given time.
Yeah.
Like Sean Alexander, especially. I mean, he had more career touchdowns,
Priest
but I
Holmes,
want,
especially, he had his 3 year run from 2001 to 2003 was insane.
but I think Sean Alexander, I think only played 8 years and
Yeah.
had more career touchdowns than Fred Taylor, who played 13.
Yeah.
So, like, that's what I'm saying. And Sean Alexander's not getting in. So
No.
that was my thing. Really, Torrey Holt, like, kind of borderline. But the problem is, like, there's a lot of really good receivers, and especially as these like Devonte Adams type players come in, and Cooper Kupp, they start to retire.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
you're
There's
gonna
like
have
a
to let
slippery
all of
slope
them.
clause, I
Yeah,
think.
like, yeah. I mean, Hall of Fame receivers like that, you have to be like Andre Johnson level good for like 10 seasons. And Torrey Holt, he didn't quite do that. He was really good. Um, I think if you want to honor the greatest show on turf, maybe you take that angle.
That was
But we
kind
already
of what
have
I was thinking with Tori. Yeah, you already have Kurt Warner, you already have Falk. Is Bruce in too?
and Orlando Pace.
In Orlando, yeah. So
So I don't know. That's just those. That's kind of how I looked at my ballot, and kind of they're all really really good players, and many of them great. But that's kind of how I would, if I had a vote, that's how I would look at it.
yeah, that's
What
fair.
about you?
No, I would be I get that. I well, you have to have conviction no matter what. I definitely do see the slippery slope clause. And Torrey Holt and Reggie Wayne. I probably got a little bit more immersed in the whole Hall of Fame meter thing. Um, and maybe some different memories I had of them. But even looking back on Reggie Wayne was somebody that when we were talking about the 2003 AFC Championship, when we were doing our prep for that, that was actually the name that first clicked in my head that time as this is a guy I think might, have a good case at making the Hall of Fame. And that's kind of why I was like, oh, if I had the option, I think I'd put him in. He had the fourth highest weighted approximate value of this entire finalist class.
Yeah.
But, uh, you know, that's also why they're senior finalists. You never know, the likes of Reggie Wayne get in one day, in 10, 15 years. The way I always look at the Hall of Fame is there's, I think, obviously there's guys that get snubbed every year and there's guys that get left off the list for a long time. But if you deserve to be there, eventually you're going to get there. Like it's just a matter of time.
Thanks for listening to the Old Souls Football Podcast. Don't forget to like, rate, and subscribe.